Okay, so the first presentation today will be provided to us by Dr. Brenda Baker. Dr. Brenda Baker is an associate professor in the School of Human Evolution and Social Change at Arizona State University. Along with being a core member of the Center for Bioarchaeological Research and curating the ancient Nubian collections housed at Arizona State University, Dr. Baker directs the Bioarchaeology of Nubia expedition, or known in short as the BONE project, which focuses on the area around Abu Hamad, which is situated approximately midway between the 4th and 5th cataracts of the Nile in northern Sudan. Dr. Brenda Baker is also a founding co-editor-in-chief of Bioarchaeology International, pardon me. And so please welcome Dr. Brenda Baker, who's joining us bright and early this morning from Arizona. Please take it away, Brenda. Thank you.
All right. Does everybody see my screen okay there?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Let me just go to the upper view, and I will say good morning to all of you. It's just after 7 a.m. here in the Phoenix area. And Robert has already given you some background about my project, which is a great acronym for this, this session, BONE, the Bioarchaeology of Nubia Expedition. And I just want to acquaint you with some of the very recent work that stems from the field work that we've conducted in the rather large project area that lies about 35 kilometers. Its eastern edge is about 35 kilometers west of Abu Hamad, which you can see on the inset at the top left. And it encompasses about 100 square kilometers, or nearly so. So far, we have identified and recorded 228 sites in the project area, and they range from earlier Stone Age all the way up to historic sites. We focused mostly in the eastern portion of the project area, which is more developed than the western portion. And you can see here the sites that I'm going to be discussing today are Kerma period cemeteries that are shown in red, and also a late Meroitic to Christian period cemetery that has radiocarbon dates between about 250 to 1400 CE, and that's the Qinifab School site shown in gray. So those are the sites that, that I'll be talking about. And the Kerma period cemetery of grave clusters like this one that's at the oldest of the excavated sites, which dates from the early to middle Kerma phases. And these sites, the Kerma period sites, are along the wadis. Many of them are clustered south of Jebel Jalud, which is the prominent landmark in our area that you see in the background. Most of these graves have been disturbed either in antiquity or more recently, and sometimes more than once. And with my graduate student, Sierra Mihal, and geospatial database manager, Sydney Rempel, we have been exploring patterns of grave reentry. So individuals from these cemeteries have also had their teeth sampled for strontium, oxygen, and carbon isotope analyses in collaboration with Leslie Gregorica. And I'll be talking about that in a few minutes. First, I want to tell you about the grave reentry. During the excavation of these cemeteries, I was observing that some of the graves were minimally disturbed, and they had very focused reentry pits that were quite small, while others, and particularly those that had been more recently disturbed, had huge pits with disarticulated bones scattered all around the perimeter, such as you see in this example on the right side of the screen. And there appeared to be two different patterns: small reentry pits that were targeting the head and neck area, and also the hands that are typically up above, right by the face, versus these large entry pits that really ruined the graves. There was a lot more disturbance to the grave as a whole. And because the position and orientation of the body in each of these graves varies quite a bit, even within a single cemetery, sometimes the head's to the north, but sometimes it's more to the northeast, the east, sometimes to the south, and occasionally even to the west. So you would have had to know how this person was positioned, and if they were on their right or left side, and where their head was oriented, in order to have a focused re-entry and disturb as little as possible to retrieve potentially heirlooms that you may have needed. So patterns of grave disturbance have not been previously examined systematically, So we set out to test this hypothesis that two different types of grave reentry actually exist and that they may be for different purposes. So of the 48 fully excavated graves that you can see had 18 females, 15 males, and 15 of indeterminate sex, which includes the pre-adults, we had entry pit dimensions available for 29. Okay, so not all of them had obvious dimensions because the grave was so badly ruined. Now, using ArcGIS Pro, the digitized entry pits that were found within each georeference polygon layer for a grave were assessed to calculate the area of each pit. So an example here is grave structure 310, which you can see what it looked like before we started to excavate. It had this big crater in the center filled with windblown sand. And you can see the georeferenced layer there in the schematic on the left. So its area was 1.94 square meters, nearly 2 square meters. In instances where there was more than one entry pit noted, which you can see in GS 316 for burial 15 at the top right. Let me get my little pen, my highlighter here going. Okay, so in this one here, there were actually two small entry pits. So in that situation, the mean of the entry pits was calculated. And for that one, it was 0.43 square meters. Once that was done, multidimensional scaling analysis was performed to investigate the similarity among the entry pit areas. And if you're wondering, what does this actually look like in the field? Here you can see what I believed to be focus reentry. The head has been removed. This hand has been disrupted. You can see the head has been tossed over to the side, but there's virtually no disruption to the rest of the grave. Whereas in a unfocused reentry situation, you can see there's a lot more of the thorax that's been completely messed up, and those bones were found throughout the grave shaft fill. So that's a very different way of, seeing how the burials themselves, the skeletons themselves, are actually disrupted. So the multi-dimensional scaling used a Euclidean distance for continuous data to measure the distance among entry pit sizes. So what happens is that entry pits that group closer together are those that have a similar area. And the analysis you can see here shows that the first dimension explains 64.4% of the total variance between the variables, and 23.5% is explained by dimension 2. So you see that on the plot here, and it's much more obvious, really, where you can see these pit area clusters in each group. They are very much separated. So the entry pit areas for group 1 range from 0.09 meters squared, really tiny, to 1.17 meters squared. And the average is just over half a meter squared. Entry pit areas for group 2, on the other hand, are much larger, and they range from 1.4 meters squared all the way up to 3.65 meters squared, and have an average of 2.2 meters squared. So that average contrasts with about a half meter for the focused reentry pits that you see in group 1. And that these results do support our hypothesis and suggest that two patterns of burial reentry really did exist in ancient Nubia. And here you see an example of one that had one of the tiniest entry pits. This is from the oldest cemetery, a burial here that had very minimal disturbance. And you can see this disturbance was again to the head, which had been detached, and the hands area, but there was still part of a faience bead circlet that was in place around the head. They probably took a necklace, perhaps, maybe some rings or a bracelet, those types of things that they meant to retrieve. They went specifically in, disrupted very, very little from this tiny little entry hole, and left the rest of the burial intact, which suggests that they were attempting to disturb as little as possible and take what was needed. So their goal is to obtain specific items. And we've been categorizing all anthropogenic postmortem disturbance of graves as looting. And we really shouldn't be doing that, because we're just putting our own value system that any sort of reentry of a grave must be illicit. It must be to take things that you shouldn't be taking. But if you've got these targeted reentry areas that are very focused and clearly had to have been done within memory of that person's burial, because you had to know how they were positioned in the grave and which way their head was oriented, so you can target those areas with the heirlooms perhaps that you need to retrieve. So we've been masking, we haven't really investigated a really large component of ancient Nubian mortuary practices by just grouping them all as looting. And this isn't just me who has been seeing these patterns. Way back in 1999, Claudia Nesser, in a study of a cemetery at Abu Simbel, noted that the reentry of graves is, quote, a deliberate, socially meaningful practice. So placement of items within a grave is an intentional act by family and community members, and it's tied to the performance of identity and the creation of social memory. So the re-entry to retrieve significant items from the deceased has a lot of implications for the transformation of the deceased into an ancestor and relations of the living with the dead and the ancestors. So we're advocating that more attention needs to be paid to disturbed contexts to distinguish this sort of targeted or focused grave reentry as a cultural practice, as a mortuary component that's distinct from actual entrances of looting or unfocused reentry. The patterns are quite different, and neglect of these differences has masked a significant component of ancient Nubian mortuary practices. So we hope you agree with that. And I want to move quickly to work on strontium isotope analyses that I've done in collaboration with Leslie Gregorica. And for those of you who were attending last week, you heard a lot about stable isotope analyses. And I just wanted to mention some of this work that's tied to the investigation of pastoralism as the first Kushite state coalesced downstream around Kerma. And as you know, from last week, bioavailable strontium is derived mainly from weathered bedrock. So it's released into the soil and groundwater, and it's ingested through the animals and plants that we eat, as well as the water that we drink. In the location where we're growing up, our tooth enamel is taking up that strontium from the soil, from the water that we drink, and so on. So it's a marker then of where people were actually growing up as the tooth enamel was forming, okay? So we wanted to investigate three main questions here. That's what I'm going to talk about today. To what extent is community mobility evident throughout the Kerma period, and do we see any changes in the extent of mobility in this project area? And is there any pattern that's based on sex? And one of the things I was really interested in was trying to find out if there's evidence of immigration into the area in conjunction with the occurrence of non-local ceramics, beads, or other unusual grave goods in the burials. So imported vessels, for instance. Okay. We examined 50 teeth from 27 individuals at the 5 Kerma period cemeteries. And for 13 individuals, we were able to sample more than one tooth. And that allows us to look at movement within these individuals' lifetimes, because the tooth crowns are forming at different ages. So you see here the distribution of the samples from the early to middle Kerma period into the classic and onto the late Kerma phases. So we're looking at, in these 5 cemeteries, a time period between 2200 and about 1100 BCE based on the radiocarbon dates from each of these grave clusters. The sample included an equal number of males and females, an adult of indeterminate sex, and 2 pre-adults of unknown sex. And Leslie also looked at the ratio of calcium to phosphorus, or Ca to P, to determine whether diagenesis had affected any of the tooth enamel. Only 5 teeth actually had to be tossed out of the sample here because they did show values that were outside the acceptable range. So removal of those teeth reduced our sample to 25 individuals. 2 males from the early to middle Kerma phase, the first phase, were eliminated. And those were actually still useful because they actually helped determine the local baseline range of bioavailable strontium along with the modern fauna that was sampled. And you see here we had an array of rodents, sheep, goat, a canid that were used as well. And the ranges from the rodents, which have a smaller area, and those 5 diagenetic human teeth produced a local range that you see here in the gray dashed lines. So that represents the local bioavailable strontium range as calculated based on those diagenetic human teeth and the rodent samples. Okay. Now, the scatter plot shows that there's a lot of variability in strontium ratios during the first phase, the early to middle Kerma period, but you see a lot less variability as you move through the Kerma phases. So it appears that, you know, people were decreasing mobility as we move through the Kerma period. And in fact, 50% of the individuals from the early to middle Kerma phase have values that fall outside the local range, compared with only 14% of the individuals from the late Kerma phase. With the teeth from the 13 individuals that we had more than 1 tooth sampled, we can look at the intervals beginning in utero for the first molar. Its development starts very early. And for the third molar, the enamel formation goes from about age 8 to 15. So we can look at the differences in the strontium isotope ratios among the teeth sampled to track mobility across different periods of childhood and get an idea of how much they were moving around as they went through childhood. And most you see here are consistent with the local bioavailable strontium range, but some people, you know, they fell well outside of it. And you can see that with the second individual from the left, from site 0314, burial 5 there, who must have come to the area after the age of 15 when the third molar has completed its formation, because you can see here the values for both the teeth that were sampled, the third molar and the premolar, are well outside the local range. Okay, so that person had to have moved into the local area sometime after the age of 15 when that third molar enamel formation is complete. Now, on the other hand, you can see that there are some other people who have ranges that are right on top of each other in the local area. They tend not to be moving around much. But you see that there's some variation in some of these other folks where, even though it's all consistent with the locally bioavailable strontium range, there does appear to be that some movement was going around as those different teeth were forming during childhood. Now, I want to call your attention to one other individual, burial 5 from site 0901, who is a late Kerma individual, if I recall correctly. That individual, oops, it's not working there, who I've got the box around, you can see that the first molar for this individual is consistent with the local area, but the second and third molars fall well outside the local range of bioavailable strontium. So it suggests that this individual might have resided in the bone project area in early childhood, maybe up to around age 4, and then left the area and resided in an isotopically dissimilar region, but then returned sometime after the age of 15 and ended up being buried at one of the cemeteries in the project area. So overall, what this pattern suggests is that both males and females were equally mobile as children, and that they were moving. You can imagine that a 4-year-old or an 8-year-old is probably not going to be managing herds and moving around on their own. So they were likely moving with kin groups that probably consisted of extended family groupings alongside their herds, particularly moving out of the project area during the rainy season to graze the animals. So finally, and I'm going to try to finish this up quickly, we were looking at whether there was any pattern in grave inclusions and whether non-local or unusual items were associated only with people whose strontium isotope ratios fell outside the local range. And you could see from the scatter plot here, that's not the case. Some individuals who had strontium isotope values that were inconsistent with the local range had local items, but others had both local and non-local items. So one example is burial 6 from the oldest site. And this male had 2 imported vessels. One at the top is Pangrave style, and an Egyptian import as well that you see at the bottom. But the grave also had quite a bit of red ochre, which is locally available, scattered along the legs particularly. And there are some individuals who had strontium isotope ratios that are consistent with the local range, like burial 17 from ASU 0930, who had both local and non-local or unusual items. In this case, she had faience and ostrich eggshell beads, plus this Egyptian pilgrim flask. So clearly an import. So the appearance of non-local grave items, whether they're imported ceramics or carnelian beads, Red Sea mollusk shell beads, or other unusual items, demonstrate that those who were interred in the bone cemeteries had ties to far-flung exchange networks. And probably they were trading and exchanging as they moved around with their herds. Now, I just briefly want to mention some of the work that we've done in the more recent periods on skeletal trauma at our large late Meroitic to Christian period cemetery. And I've undertaken this work recently with a undergraduate student, Mackenzie Wright. And the main portion of the cemetery you see here is adjacent to the old Qinifab School, hence the name of the site, the Qinifab School site. We have a total of 100 individuals to examine from this particular site, 67 adults and 33 pre-adults from this sample. And the rate of trauma in this sample is quite high. 44% of individuals exhibit trauma. And that contrasts with the Kerma and Napatan sample that I just discussed, where there are only about 3 of 48, or just over 6% of individuals who show any trauma, and they're likely accidental, nothing due to interpersonal violence. Whereas in this later cemetery, we see 31 of these 44 people with trauma show healed and unhealed trauma that's indicative of interpersonal violence. And you see an array of slot fracture from a wound to the shoulder, a stab wound on a hip, some of the arrows in one of the graves, and that was the grave of the man whose sternum is actually penetrated by an arrow. So you can see we have very clear evidence of interpersonal violence, conflict at this time, and that corresponds with the appearance of archery equipment in the graves of several males, as well as the construction of forts. And we have a fort, stone-walled fort, in the project area, not very far from this cemetery. So this is an era of conflict. Many people have multiple injuries, in fact, 20. of the people have multiple injuries, like this Christian period female. And some of this was inflicted purposefully. You can see she's got a cranial depression fracture, but an array of other fractures throughout her skeleton, including a really horrible fracture of the femoral neck that displaced the femoral head and neck, so it was slanted downward and more forward. And when we excavated it, her femoral head, the round part, was still fit into the hip socket. So it didn't get displaced, but it would have shortened her leg, and it would have caused some problems with full rotation of the hip. So she would have had impaired hip rotation, a shortened left leg, and an altered gait. But she probably increased her mobility through the use of crutches, and we see that with a lot of osteoarthritis in her shoulders. So we can look at the population level and we can look at the individual level. We're doing that through multiple sorts of analyses, as you see here, to try to get a better idea of just what's going on with this sample of people who were buried over time and how the rates of trauma are actually changing. And the Christian period men, you can see just from a quick glance here, experienced higher rates of trauma as well as interpersonal violence than Christian period females and both sexes in the earlier phase, the late to post-Meroitic. So I want to end that with a big thank you to all of the funding agencies, my collaborators, of course, and everybody who worked on the bone team in the field, and particularly to the Sudanese people. My greatest wish is for peace and stability to come very soon to Sudan. So thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. Thanks, Brenda. That was a great presentation. Thanks so much for joining us today. I think. Okay. Ivana, can we switch? Sorry,
Yes,
I think.
please.
There we go. Okay.
Hello.
Thanks, Vani. I was not certain of how to do that. Okay. So excellent. Thank you so much for that presentation. That was wonderful. We will move now to the next presentation. So, Dr. Jana Egger-Karberg is a research associate in the Institute of Egyptology and Coptology at the Westfälische Wilhelms University in Münster. Dr. Egger-Karberg has been involved in numerous projects in Sudan, with a particular area of focus being in the Bayuda, Kordofan, and Western regions, including as co-field director on the Wadi Abu Dam itinerary, or Wadi project, and is currently the lead researcher of the Interlink project, which focuses in particular on the Jebel al-Ain area in Western Sudan, as a frontier contact zone between Sahelian and Nilotic Valley cultures. Dr. Tim Karberg of the Institute of Egyptology and Coptology of the University of Münster is affiliated with the Wadi project, in particular focusing on the El Rum Oasis and Ruim, my apologies, I'm not certain how to pronounce that, among other areas in the Bayuda and Western regions of Sudan. Dr. Karberg has been a visiting lecturer at Al Nilain University in Khartoum and is the managing director of the Sudan Archaeological Society in Berlin. He has a particular research interest in rock art. Dr. Egger-Karberg and Dr. Karberg join us today to discuss astronomical alignments and the implications of such for interpreting tumuli and box graves in the Bayuda Desert. Thank you for joining us today, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I share my screen. Can everybody see anything?
Yes.
Okay, great.
It's fine.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. Today, Jana and I will present some ideas about alignments and orientations of burial superstructures investigated exemplarily on some cemeteries in the Wadi Abu Dam in the central Bayuda. Unfortunately, Jana cannot join us today, therefore I will read our presentation. This is an extended, revised, and updated version of a presentation initially read at the annual meeting of the German Astronomical Society in 2021. The archaeological survey project Wadi Abu Dom Itinerary investigated the banks of this wadi in the central Bayuda from 2009 till 2016 under the leadership of Angelika Lohwasser, professor of Egyptology at the University of Münster. During the survey, several cemeteries of tumuli as well as box graves were documented, and some of them archaeologically investigated in detail, especially near Bir Merwa in 2015. Above all, the survey database provides us with data about the alignment and orientation of more than 1,250 grave superstructures, which are analyzed in some detail in this investigation. The chronological sequence of the central Bayuda is mainly defined by successive forms of characteristic burial superstructures, which resemble index records of at least 3 cultural phases. During the late Meroitic phase and the post-Meroitic phase, flat tumuli, mostly 5 to 20 meter in diameter, erected on flat terraces of wadis and khors, are a typical burial superstructure. While during the Christian Middle Ages, smaller rectangular burial superstructures, in most cases about 200 by 60 centimeter, are common. Both types of burial often occur in close topographical proximity to each other, indicating that the cemeteries were in continuous use from late antiquity until the Middle Ages. Both types of grave superstructures are in principle of some astronomical interest, as they are usually oriented in a specific and characteristic way. The tumuli of late antiquity are generally circular in shape, but many of them have a significant protrusion on one side. For this reason, this type of mound burials is sometimes referred to as a nose tumulus. In many cases, this protrusion covers an additional pit for grave goods, but in other cases, it appears to be purely decorative. In many cases, the protrusion of these barrows is oriented to the southeast or east. This suggests an astronomical interpretation of this phenomenon. The clear orientation of the tumuli analyzed here is given due to this protrusion, or less formally nose, often associated with the offering pit. The nose is a signifying construction element, which could, in some cases, be interpreted as a seasonal pointer towards the winter solstice, but in many other cases also not. A significant cluster of orientations centers around 121 degrees, but there are also many tumuli oriented in a wide variety far beyond the possible span of at least solar and other ecliptical phenomena. Questions of orientation also play an important role in medieval box graves. Like many Christian religious installations, their axis generally points to the east. The ideal nature of this orientation, as well as explanations for deviations from the standard orientation, will be discussed later in this presentation. Here, the distribution of major cemeteries from both periods are displayed. The largest cemeteries, consisting of tumuli, are situated in the middle Wadi Abu Dom, while the most dense concentrations of box graves are found in the lower Wadi Abu Dom in the direct vicinity of the monastery of Rasali. The general questions in this paper are whether the orientation of grave superstructures has astronomical implications, whether they follow some kind of precise alignment or a more or less ideal orientation, the role of topographical features, and the interaction between different elements of the material culture, like graves from different time periods, or other architectural elements. During the Wadi Abu Dom Itinerary Survey project, a total of 1,003 late Meroitic or post-Meroitic terrace tumuli were discovered. Of these, 213 show a clear and measurable orientation of their superstructure and were therefore included in this study. Most of these orientations are to the southeast or east. 192 of the 213 tumuli are oriented within a segment of the compass rose between 90 degree and 121 degree. Outside this segment, there are only single grave structures to be found. However, among these singular orientations, there are a few tumuli with protrusions pointing south, west, and even northwest, which complicates the astronomical explanation of this phenomenon. Anyway, the significance of this distribution pattern is proven by a W value of 0.158 and a p-value of less than 0.001 in a Shapiro-Wilks normality test. Of the 1,342 medieval box graves, the majority, 523, face east within a range of 75 degrees till 105 degrees, as expected for Christian religious installations. However, a large minority, 449 box graves, are oriented slightly more to the southeast, comparably to the late and post-Meroitic tumuli, within an orientation range of 109 degrees till 132 degrees. Most of these southeast-facing box graves are found in the immediate vicinity of the Ghazali monastery in the lower Wadi Abu Dom. The significance of the distribution pattern is even more clear than with the tumuli, with a W value of 0.117 and a p-value of also less than 0.001 in a normality test after Shapiro-Wilks. First, we will take a closer look at some box grave cemeteries around the monastery of Ghazali. As you can see, only few of the box graves at the largest cemetery, west of the monastery at Ghazali, show the expected easting precisely. They are concentrated in the westernmost rows and the southern part of the cemetery. Most other burial superstructures around the monastery of Ghazali show a clear southeastern deviation from the ideal easting. At another cemetery near the mouth of the Wadi Dejamon into the Wadi Abu Dom, where box graves are associated with tumuli, we find at the first glance similar situation. Here, the box grave superstructures following the regular easting of Christian burials most regularly are found in the north of the cemetery, but also concentrate in its western rows. As a third example for box grave cemeteries, we will take a look at a graveyard near the pediment of the Jebel Ras Dome in the upper Wadi Abu Dom. Here, interestingly, the idea of easting is obeyed rather strictly throughout the whole cemetery, which differs quite significantly from both the cemeteries investigated before at Ghazali and at the Wadi Dejamon. Despite the fact that the orientation of both the late and post-Meroitic tumuli and the medieval box graves is not completely uniform, their distribution in certain directions is highly significant, as already pointed out quantitatively before. However, this statistical significance does not tell us anything qualitatively about the nature of these distribution patterns. As it's often the case when dealing with significantly distributed orientations of archaeological records, astronomical implications of these observations could be considered. At the first glance, the general southeastern focus of these orientation patterns, with an angular mean of 111 degrees, suggests some correlation with ecliptic phenomena, which of course can deviate 23.5 degrees from the 90-degree easting. On the other hand, some isolated outliers contradict this idea. 3 burial mounds oriented between 270 and 280 degrees could be interpreted as complementary orientations to an eastern or southeastern orientation focus, but other single outliers do not fit into this scheme at all. A very irregular horizon as the main reason for different orientations can be ruled out, since only in very few cases tumuli cemeteries are located in very rugged terrain, and the vast majority of grave superstructures are located in places where the horizon is quite visible. As an example, this you can see here in a modeling of the horizon view from the monastery of Ghazali, during the sunrise of the spring equinox of the year 800 AD, which this modeling used the astronomical software Stellarium developed by the University Observatory of Vienna, version 0.20.1, and Horizon version 0.13c, fed with an SRTM 1 arcsecond digital terrain model as raw data. The general southeastern orientation of the late and post-Meroitic tumuli corresponds to several other cult sites, temples, chapels, and tombs of the Neo-Kushite period. In Egyptian cult architecture, which to some extent served as a role model for Kushite architecture, the topographical orientation of religious installations was common, in most cases, towards the Nile or other major watercourses. During the Neo-Kushite period, however, there are some evidence that the orientation of Kushite funerary structures and temples towards the Nile in the Napatan region by pure coincidence of the riverine topography to the southeast, at some point underwent a transformative cultural reinterpretation from a topographical to a geographical contextualization. Astronomical aspects, especially cult references to solar phenomena, are discussed, for example, already by Tim Kendall for the earliest forms of such a cult transformation in funerary contexts already in the early Neo-Kushite period, but according to the current state of research, they are not generally accepted. Later, during the Meroitic phase of the Neo-Kushite period, a southeastern orientation became the standard for elaborate funerary architecture, as well as for specific Kushite temples with an architectural layout and cult concept that differed significantly from earlier Egyptian examples. For the late and post-Meroitic tumuli of the Wadi Abu Dom, the statistical spread of the superstructure alignments contradicts a precise orientation towards specific celestial phenomena, even if the erection of these structures during different time spans of the astronomical years assumed. 17 of 213 tumuli superstructures incorporated into the study, or 8% of the whole data corpus after all, show orientations far beyond the reach of directions of any possible ecliptic phenomena, even when including the widespread maxima of the major lunar standstills, which extends the solar phenomena. Christian medieval box graves show, as already stated above, also some fluctuation of their general alignment around the ideal easting as assumed for Christian religious installations. The angular average of the orientations is 104 degrees, while 357 superstructures alone are oriented quite precisely towards 90 degrees east. 606 box graves are oriented to the southeast, while only 77 are oriented to the northeast. The northernmost direction is 57 degrees, the southernmost 137. Interestingly, most of the southeast-facing box graves are found in the immediate vicinity of the Ghazali monastery. The two churches of this Christian complex have their apses facing 108 degrees southeast, as shown here. Obviously, the churches should have followed the ideal apsis east as a liturgical orientation common in medieval churches. However, this was not carried out exactly. Despite the fact that the eastern orientation of medieval churches was in many cases determined by astronomical measurements, astronomical reasons for the deviation from the ideal eastern orientation can be ruled out, since, as shown in the modeling above, the natural landscape horizon at this site is almost identical to the theoretical horizontal plane. Therefore, the deviation in the orientation of the church is probably due to the topography of the Wadi terrace for purely practical reasons on which the building was constructed. The site of the church is located on a geological protrusion of the high floor terrace of the Wadi within a bend of the Wadi bed. This causes the terrain to slope slightly from southwest to northeast. Therefore, The southeastern deviation from the ideal east orientation allowed the architects to build the church on a level side, whereas following the east orientation exactly would have resulted in a slightly sloping side for the building, or would have at least required extensive leveling of the construction site. Due to their size, the tomb superstructures are not directly affected by the topography of the site. Along the maximum length of 2 meters of a box grave superstructure, the sloping terrain has no measurable effect. However, the nearby church probably influenced the orientation of the surrounding cemeteries. In other parts of the Wadi Abu Dom, the ideal easting of the box grave superstructures was, as shown above, followed more closely. Without an architectural reference point, definition of the eastern cardinal point was obviously more important. While the idea of easting of Christian cult installations in the medieval period remains undisputed, the use of astronomical observations to define the eastern cardinal point remains highly probable. Anyway, the southeastern deviation of some of these box grave superstructures from the ideal easting, especially observed in the vicinity of the monastery of Rasali, cannot be explained easily with astronomical measurements or more or less measurements, since as shown above, the natural landscape horizon as this site does not differ that much from the theoretical horizontal line, at least when looking eastward. At the first glance, the idea of an influence of the preferred southeastern alignment of the earlier tumuli of the late Meroitic and post-Meroitic phases, as shown above, seems tempting. Indeed, there are several graveyards within the Wadi Abu Dom where late Iron Age tumuli and Christian medieval box graves were obviously closer connected to each other, indicating a gradual transition between both periods rather than a cultural gap, which is also shown by the by the development of the excavated graves near Bir Merwa. After taking a closer look on the material, this idea nevertheless seems less convincing. Of course, topographical entanglement of earlier tumuli and later box graves at some graveyards results in some slight southeastern deviation of the box graves from the ideal easting, obviously following the tumuli as a role model, and at graveyards consisting of box graves only, as shown at the Ras Adum, the easting of the medieval grave superstructures was obeyed more precisely. Anyway, the orientation deviations at Rasali and at mixed cemeteries in the middle Wadi Abu Dom differ from each other. At the Wadi Bend of Rasali, the largest amount of box graves is a significant southeastern deviation of the orientation, as well as with in numbers the strongest deviations according to their circular angle are documented. And here, no late or post-Meroitic tumuli are found in the direct vicinity. As assumed above, the purely practical interpretation seems most likely that the churches of the monastic complex of Rasali deviated from the ideal Christian easting by simply following the necessities of the local topography, and the alignment of the box grave superstructures of the direct vicinity followed the churches as their role model. This indicates that monocausal interpretations of such specific alignments are somehow misleading. Getting back to the preferred southeastern orientation of the tumuli of the late and post-Meroitic phase, a similar interpretation modeled along the Christian concepts of an ideal easting seems possible. While the transformation process of the alignment of cult installations in elite funeral architecture already started in the early Neo-Kushite period, it became widespread in various elite cult installations, including Apedemak and other specific temples, and finally became an element of non-elite funeral architecture during the late and post-Meroitic phase. This might be connected to religious developments where solar aspects of the major deities gained more importance, and be interpreted as a kind of cult democratization of religious aspects which were, at their starting point, rather a kind of elite project, while they later became also part of the more traditional popular belief. This would rather fit to the models of socio-cultural transformation processes, as, for example, already defined by Claude Lévi-Strauss. Anyway, The southeastern orientation of these grave superstructures, with their relatively wide statistical spread, indicates an ideal religious concept comparable to the easting in Christian culture, rather than a precise alignment on, on real-world astronomical events. Astronomical observations might, as it is assumed for medieval church and grave constructions, have played an indirect role in order to define the general direction of these constructions, but obviously, precise constructions aligned to, on calendar events and so-called star deities was not considered necessary by the builders. So, to get to a conclusion, we should not overstress archaeoastronomy. Anyway, we should take into consideration that astronomy played an important role for estimating time and direction in everyday life, more or less a kind of folk astronomy, and therefore many data which seems to bear some astronomical significance might be due to the fact that astronomical aspects were used as auxiliary tools for defining directions, but are not indications of the sun or star cult or a role of buildings as precise astronomical calendars, as it is often rashly assumed, especially among non-academic citizen science-based archaeoastronomical communities. Thank you very much for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that presentation, Tim. That was great. So interesting. I'm not certain if you are still... Vana, can we switch the screens? Maybe.
Hi.
Okay, there we go.
I think you're in full control. So.
Okay, very good, very good. Thanks. Sorry, I never know when it's sharing or not sharing. That should be okay.
Okay.
I should know better. Okay, so moving on. Thank you very much for that presentation, Tim. That was wonderful. Now, last but not least is, or perhaps least, is myself. So I am Robert Stark. I'm from the Polish Center of Mediterranean Archaeology at the University of Warsaw, and I will be speaking to you today about some bioarchaeology research at Old Dongola. So, bearing this sharing going well, I shall proceed. Let us see here. Okay, are you able to see what is going on here?
Right now we see your PowerPoint.
Perfect. And you can see me moving it. This is okay?
Now we see the individual slides. Right.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, excellent. So thank you all. So as I had mentioned, I will speak to you today about burial archaeology at Old Dongola, some bioarchaeological insights. So this presentation will be an overview of some work that's been going on and that has gone on previously at Old Dongola. So for those of you not familiar with the site, Old Dongola was the capital of Makuria, the kingdom of Makuria, from circa the 6th through 14th century of the Common Era. The site itself is quite large, being approximately 200 hectares in size, which to put it in terms of other areas is akin to the size of Paris in the 11th century, so quite a large site. The site has been under excavation by the Polish Center of Mediterranean Archaeology of the University of Warsaw in collaboration with the National Corporation for Antiquities and Museums of Sudan since 1964, and is currently directed by Dr. Artur Obuski. So at the site, a large number of areas have been identified, have been excavated, namely a number of monasteries and churches, a citadel area with many structures, large medieval cemetery, a Muslim cemetery with Quba tombs, and there are still many unsurveyed areas. So I present this to you today in the sense of a lot has been uncovered at Old Dongola, and there still remains a lot ongoing to be identified. So I will focus on burial archaeology today. And so placing this on the broader map, you can see here where the location of Old Dongola is here within Makuria. And on the right-hand side of this image, you can see a number of the elements of the site that I just mentioned. So in terms of bioarchaeological research at Old Dongola, the nature of bioarchaeological research has been, I put here, sporadic and coincidental. There's not really one unifying term, but a lot of the excavations of burials and skeletal materials at Old Dongola have been as a reflection of ongoing excavations in other areas. So this is to say that a church was under excavation and a number of burials were identified. Those burials were documented and excavated. And so they were coincidental in this sense, in that they were identified and excavated when they came up. And so a number of individuals have played a large role in documenting the burials at this site. between the 1960s and 1980s. The work of Tadeusz Jerzy-Rogalski and Elżbieta Prominska documented a number of burials, particularly within the churches, the Church of the Granite Columns, on the Citadel area, this landscape. In the 1990s, Bogdan Żurowski documented a lot of the burial styles, so the types of burials that could be noticed on the surface. How are they constructed? What sort of methods were used? What variations are identifiable? And also of importance to the region in the 1990s in collaboration with Dr. Mahmoud Al-Tayeb, excavations at Jebel Gadar, which is just a short distance from the site of Old Dongola. So a number of burials were excavated there as well. Moving into the 2000s, Robert Mahler excavated in the Qom H area, in the monastery in Qom H, in particular the burial of Anna and the crypts. There are 3 burial crypts. I'll show you a photo in a little bit, documenting the multiple burials inside of each of these crypts. And more recently, I myself have started undertaking bioarchaeological research at the site in 2019 and into the 2020s today. And I put various here as the burials documented are various. They're from various areas of the site, but most primarily in the medieval cemetery. So let's see what we found a little bit. So we are not conducting, and there are no excavations of burials in the Muslim cemetery, but there is an ongoing community engagement project that I'd like to mention. Tamami Fushia and colleagues of the Polish Center of Mediterranean Archaeology have been discussing with local community members in Gadar the role and importance of the gubas in the community and the connections to still living individuals in this community area. So I won't talk about this or this project at all, but I just wanted to bring it forward and to show you, if you're not familiar with what I mean by a guba tomb. They're these large dome-shaped tombs that, if you drive to Old Dongola, define the landscape as you come along the road, or at least I would say they define the landscape. So today I'll talk about 3 sort of areas of burial research at the site. So first I'll talk about a burial that was identified in the Citadel area. I'll talk about research in the medieval cemetery, and I'll talk about some ongoing research in the Qom H crypts. So in 2019, a burial was identified on the surface in the Citadel area. This burial had been eroded from wind removal, and it was determined best practice to remove the elements that had remained on the surface, as you can see in this photo here. So upon initial identification, it was quite evident that this burial was highly disturbed. You can see here that skeletal materials were quite scattered. And so in excavating this burial, it was decided to remove them, but it became evident that this burial was actually, in fact, quite well preserved. So to switch back here, you can see these skeletal fragments, which are mostly from the skull. And I believe why they're so fragmented is it seems that a mud brick or some piece of structural remain had, over the course of time, fallen onto the burial area and increasingly fragmented this skull. But you can see here that the majority of the skeleton is quite well preserved, which was a surprise to me when excavating it. And so in documenting this burial, a number of interesting things came to light. You can see it's laid out in an extended position on its back. The lower photo here shows that some type of textile was present in the burial. Whether this was a specific burial shroud or clothing is uncertain, but we can see from preserved material on the skeleton that something was present in the burial. The individual who was interred in this location was an adult female of about 18 to 24 years. The stature of the individual was just short of 160 centimeters. And as I had mentioned, the skull was post-depositionally altered, while the rest of the skeletal remains were quite well preserved. And I had mentioned that this burial is atypical or not expected, and this is for a number of reasons. The burial is not expected and is atypical in its location. It was identified within the remains of House BH121, so a non-typical burial location on the Citadel area. It is not evidently marked or deeply dug. There was no evidence of bricks or a dug grave or any sort of structure associated specifically with the burial. The orientation and positioning of the burial does not conform to Christian or Muslim burial traditions in the region. And previously in the area, in earlier years, the presence of cattle horns and pottery had been identified in association with this burial, which brings into question the locality of this individual. Cattle horns and pottery are not typical of the time period of occupation at Old Dongola, nor of Christian or Muslim burial traditions. So this brings forth a lot of questions about the nature of this burial. It seems evidently to have been from a later period of occupation or use at Old Dongola, and it suggests an individual who may have come from a non-local area, perhaps somewhere further south, perhaps somewhere down the Nile in that region. Parallels have been identified with several groups in this region, the Dinka, the Shilluk. And so we have a lot of questions, and myself and Dorota have been looking into this a little further as to what we can say about this burial, but this is just an overview of what has been identified to date. So we'll move to what has been going on in the medieval cemetery at Old Dongola. As you can see here in the blue outline, this is the area of the medieval cemetery here and on the other side of the monastery on Calm H. So it's quite a large area. It's quite a substantial cemetery landscape. And so far, my research and ongoing research with the PCMA has identified or excavated 6 graves in this area called graves 1 through 6. And so by just sheer coincidence, grave 1 was probably, I would say, the most typical of what I would expect to find in this area. So 2 of these graves, grave 2 and grave 1, as you can see in this map on the left here, were identified in close proximity to one another. Grave 1, and you'll see here this large term ODB4 or UB4, these are just internal codes for identifying the individuals that were excavated, was the interment of a single individual. So this is a single adult individual, as you can see on the bottom right here, interred supine on their back with a brick vaulted tomb placed over top of them. So a very typical sort of burial that we would expect to see in this time period at Old Dongola and in broader medieval contexts in Sudan. So I use this as sort of the litmus test of what I would expect to find, but what proved to be in all reality the exception. As moving on to grave 2, a burial a short distance from grave 1, which we've been able to obtain a radiocarbon date for an individual here. So ODB 20, you see at the top, was probably one of the first individuals identified in this burial or interred in this burial, dating to 665 to 822 CE, so this window of time. And I say individuals as this was a multiple burial containing 15 individuals. And if you were quick in catching it, you can see that this burial of grave 1 and this burial of grave 2 are, in terms of physical dimensions, almost identical. But grave 2 contained, as I mentioned, 15 individuals, a mixture of adult males and females, as well as subadults in this burial. And while most of the burials were interred on their backs in an extended position, it's also quite evident that this space was very limited for this number of burials, as there were several individuals who were ultimately on their side or positioned seemingly as if to place them in anywhere they could sort of fit. But by and large, an east-west orientation is evident. And of particular note in this burial was the presence of 3 individuals. You can see here in this orange rectangle, I've placed around the skeletal remains of 1 individual. And this is because in this area, whoops, in what we can see at the bottom here, there were 3 individuals, one atop the other, I would say partway into the tomb and partway out of the tomb. So you can see in the bottom left-hand image here that there's, as you would expect, a sort of chambered area for the tomb. And then on the right-hand side, this short sort of keyhole-shaped area that was probably the entryway for placing individuals into the tomb. So effectively, these 3 individuals that were identified in this area had their lower half, or they had the lower half of their torsos inside the tomb and had the upper half of their torsos in the proposed entryway or exterior of the tomb, which again further brings into question the nature of this burial and why 15 individuals were interred in this single burial or in a burial space that is typically used for 1 individual. It's really unclear. I don't know that we'll ever fully know as to why this was the case for having 15 individuals in this burial. Perhaps some further research can tell us in terms of dating or if we were able to get DNA evidence, if they were related anyway, but there is no clear reason on the surface of it as to why 15 individuals were placed in this one burial, making it quite interesting thus far. And so, as I had mentioned, for the sort of initial expectation of the types of burials I would encounter while working here, this was again undermined, or not undermined, but challenged in the identification of grave 3, as I thought, okay, grave 1 and grave 2 have a quite similar style. I would think that perhaps grave 3 might be the same, but in all reality, grave 3 is quite different from all of the burials that I've identified here to date. So grave 3 is located a short distance away from grave 1 and grave 2, but uses a deep shaft to access a vaulted tomb. As you can see, or hopefully can see in these images here on the top left, there's a very deep shaft leading down to a little staircase with a blocked entryway that goes into a vaulted tomb, as you can see on the bottom right here, that is about 55 centimeters in height and about 45 in width. So very narrow space. And it is quite evident that there are multiple individuals buried within this tomb. Ultimately, this grave remains to be fully excavated, as it was not, frankly, physically possible to fit for the purposes of excavation in through this doorway. So we have identified this aspect of the burial and have resealed it for a better strategy later, as it was very, very physically limiting to fit in that space, as in I could not really fit my shoulders through the doorway. So we hope to develop a better method in the future. Again, in identifying the next two graves, so I'll do a little quick flip here, grave 4 and grave 5, you can see that a similar strategy was used in both of these cases, but again, a different approach to the other previously mentioned 3 burials. So in this case, we have a very typical surface structure of mud bricks laid out, forming a sort of bed of bricks, down to a shaft at the bottom of which was identified a single adult burial. Interesting in this burial here, and I've not come across a lot of this in the literature in other burials. This is not to say that it doesn't exist or hasn't been documented. It's to say that I have not come across this as yet. If someone knows of this, please let me know. But a interesting brick, sort of, I don't want to say mort safe, but covering over the body was used at the bottom here. So you can see in the central image here, or I hope you can see in the central image here, there are effectively 2 ledges on either side of the bottom of the grave. And onto these ledges were placed, as you can see in the very bottom left image here, a series of bricks in a very specific pattern blocking over top of the body. So effectively there was a row of bricks on either side that edged in towards the middle, placed flat and inwards, and on top of those were a series of vertically aligned bricks placed from head to foot, spanning the length of the body. As you can see in the bottom here, it covers the entire body. Underneath of which was an adult individual that conforms quite typically to what we would expect in the medieval time period. So an adult individual interred on their back with their hands over their pelvis and their feet crossed over each other. And it's quite evident that some form of textile was present. I would say most likely a burial shroud, as there's the presence of rope or binding material, arguably to keep the shroud in place. But it's quite possible that some form of clothing was also retained on the body of the individual in burial. Again, this is not clear from the evidence. And the burial of this individual from radiocarbon dating places it within the period from 568 to 650 CE. A similar situation is evident with grave 5 here. You can see it on the right, or sorry, on the left here of this individual. And so I won't talk much about this, as it was quite similar to what we saw in the other burial, an extended adult individual. But what was interesting in the excavation of this burial was the identification of a very close shallow burial of a subadult individual, a very young individual. You can see in this oblong yellow shape here, this sort of oval yellow shape. And this was interesting for a number of reasons. One, because it was a young child, but most importantly here, because it was very, very shallow, circa at its maximum 30 centimeters below the surface. And it's sort of this carved out area, the shape of a young body, but it falls directly in between the superstructures of 2 adjacent burials. And so it's a really odd position as well, as it's very shallow and directly in between these 2 structures, increasing the oddity of this burial. Not to say that it's an oddity, but increasing the atypical nature of this burial was the radiocarbon date obtained for it, which presents a date of 39 BCE to 204 CE. So this radiocarbon date is in question. It isn't really certain why this date would be derived from it, so we're hoping to reanalyze the burial in this sense. But as you can imagine, the presence of a burial of this date would be very odd in the medieval cemetery at Old Dongola. And so the combination of the very, very unexpected date with the very, very atypical burial style brings a lot of question onto what the nature of this burial is. Even if we were to play devil's advocate and suggest, okay, this radiocarbon date accurately places it in the time period from 39 BCE to 204 CE, the positioning of it is such that either the burial would have to have been identified by subsequent inhabitants of the site, and 2 well-aligned burials placed literally centimeters on either side of it, which seems a very odd approach, given that there are no other evident burials that have used this strategy here or in my previous research at Ghazali. I've never seen such a thing like this before. So really, grave 6 here is quite unexpected. Again, if any of you have seen anything like this or have any commentary as to how this perhaps is not so odd, I would be delighted to hear anything you might be able to tell me. And lastly, I would like to just touch upon some ongoing research in the crypts on the monastery, and the monastery on Qamage. So as I had alluded to before, 3 crypts, as you can see here, the probably most famous of the 3 crypts, as it has writing on all over the walls here in the crypt of so-called Georgios on the monastery on Qamage at Old Dongola. As I noted, Robert Mahler had excavated all 3 of these crypts previously, and in collaboration with Robert Mahler, I'm now involved with, or we're now involved with, taking on some further research in terms of radiocarbon dating of the individuals in the crypts to see the temporality of use for these crypts. Were they used at the same time? Was one crypt used before the other? What are the dating of individuals, as there are multiple individuals in each crypt? We're also undertaking analyses of carbon and nitrogen and strontium to assess if the individuals in these crypts were perhaps local or non-local and what sort of diets they're eating. And so the rationale behind this, beyond simply documentary evidence, is one of the questions is, were bishops or elites at Old Dongola coming from elsewhere? Were bishops appointed to serve in the bishopric at Old Dongola from elsewhere? And if so, were they mobile to the site? So we're trying to address these sorts of questions, as well as the inference here is that these individuals buried in these crypts in the monastery on Qamage, or in the area of the monastery on Qamage, were arguably, higher status individuals in Dongolan society. This inference has been made. And so we're looking to see if there's a dietary variation between the individuals in these crypts and future research that we'll undertake on dietary reconstruction in the medieval cemetery at Old Dongola. So we're trying to place these individuals in the broader Dongolan society. And so this has been a very brief overview of the sort of state of research of bioarchaeological documentation at Old Dongola at the moment. But as with everything, it is not alone. So I'd really greatly like to acknowledge the Old Dongola and UMA ERC teams that have been working at the site over years and currently ongoing, as well as the Polish Center of Mediterranean Archaeology of the University of Warsaw, the National Corporation for Antiquities and Museums of Sudan, and of course, the wonderful communities of Old Dongola and Gadar, Sudan, where project members live during excavations. And it has been wonderful to be so welcomed in this community. So thank you all for your attention. And if you have any questions or comments, both for me or for the other presenters, as I'm also hosting this, we can transition to those now. Thank you for your attention.